Imagine a routine traffic stop turning into a high-stakes confrontation where authority and composure collide. A sharp-suited black man is pulled over by a skeptical and hostile police officer, but as the tension escalates, a quiet revelation shifts the balance of power. What unfolds next is a gripping test of control, bias, and accountability that leaves you questioning who really holds the upper hand. The sun was setting over the quiet streets of suburban Atlanta, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Deputy Ethan Graves, a seasoned officer with a hard-set jaw and a mirrored pair of aviators, cruised the streets with an air of practiced authority. His patrol car gleamed under the golden hues of the evening light as he scanned the road for anything that might demand his attention. At the corner of Elm and Bay Street, he spotted a sleek black sedan rolling to a gentle stop at a four-way intersection. Something about it, a gut feeling or perhaps an unconscious bias, made him tap the brakes and slow to a crawl. A figure in the driver's seat, silhouetted by the last rays of sunlight, shifted slightly. The car's tinted windows obscured most details, but that didn't stop Graves' instincts from kicking into overdrive. Flipping on the siren, he directed the sedan to the side of the road. The driver, composed and precise, immediately complied, signaling and pulling over in a single fluid motion. Graves exited his vehicle with a deliberate pace, his hand brushing the holster on his belt as if to remind himself and the driver of his authority. As he approached, the window slid down smoothly, revealing a man in his early 40s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. His tie was crisp, his collar impeccable, and a glint from the cufflinks on his wrists caught the evening light. The man looked up, meeting Graves' gaze with steady, unreadable eyes. "Evening, officer," the man said with calm politeness. His voice was rich, measured, and betrayed no sign of unease. "License and registration," Graves barked, ignoring the greeting. He didn't wait for the man to comply before leaning slightly into the open window, scanning the pristine interior of the car for anything out of place. The driver's movements were slow and deliberate as he retrieved his wallet and the vehicle's documents. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" he inquired, his tone unwavering. Graves smirked faintly as he examined the license. "Didn't seem like you came to a full stop back there," he said, though his voice carried an edge of doubt, as if he was fishing for a reason, rather than stating one. The man raised an eyebrow, his expression mild. "I believe I did, but I'm sure you'll clarify if there's a misunderstanding." That response seemed to annoy Graves. He glanced again at the license, his lips curling slightly when he noticed the address. "Not from around here, are you?" "No," the man replied evenly. "I relocated a few months ago. My address is current, as you'll see." Graves' eyes lingered on the license, then flipped back to the man's face. "What brings you to this area?" The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "I live here." "Is there a problem with that, officer?" Graves stiffened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Just doing my job. We've had incidents around here. Got to make sure everyone's on the up and up." The driver leaned back slightly, folding his hands on the steering wheel. "Incidents involving men in suits driving sedans? Or is there something more specific I should be aware of?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Graves' jaw tightened as he shifted his stance, his hand once again brushing his belt. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice sharp. The man's expression didn't change, though a brief pause preceded his next words. "Is there a reason for that request?" "Do I need one?" Graves snapped, his posture growing more aggressive. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The driver sighed softly, reaching for the door handle. "Very well, though I must say this is an interesting approach to community policing." Graves' eyes narrowed as the man stepped out of the car. He was taller than the officer by a few inches, his frame lean but commanding. The suit only enhanced his presence, the fabric draping perfectly over his broad shoulders. He clasped his hands loosely in front of him as he faced Graves, who gestured curtly toward the hood of the car. "Hands where I can see them," Graves said, his tone biting. The man complied without hesitation, his movements smooth and deliberate. "I assume you'll be conducting a search. Should I be aware of any particular concern?" Graves' smirk returned as he began patting the man down, his hands moving with unnecessary roughness. Just being thorough. Never know what someone might be hiding. The driver didn't flinch, his posture remaining as composed as ever. Of course, thoroughness is important, though one might question the basis for suspicion in this case. Graves paused briefly, his eyes darting up to meet the man's gaze. You got smart mouth on you. What is it you do, exactly? The man allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. I work in the legal field. Figures, Graves muttered, stepping back and folding his arms. You lawyers think you know everything, don't you? I never claim to know everything, the man replied. But I do know my rights. And I'd be curious to hear what justification you'll provide for this treatment, should it be called into question. Perfectly still by his car, his hands clasped in front of him, waiting with an air of quiet authority that only stoked Graves' frustration further. Minutes ticked by as the officer drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his irritation mounting with each passing second. Finally, the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio again. Unit 357, badge number checks out. Assistant District Attorney Alexander Pierce, active status. Anything else you need? Graves hesitated, his grip tightening on the radio. Negative, he muttered, his voice clipped. He dropped the radio back into its holder and exhaled sharply. The confirmation should have ended things, but instead it fueled his frustration. He stepped out of the car and slammed the door shut with more force than necessary, striding back toward Pierce. Looks like you've done your homework, Graves said, his voice laced with thinly veiled hostility. But just because the badge is real doesn't mean you're off the hook. Pierce's brow lifted slightly, his expression a study in calm curiosity. Is that so? And what exactly do you believe I'm? Slightly, his expression a study in calm curiosity. Is that so? And what exactly do you believe I'm on the hook for, officer? Don't play games with me. Graves snapped, stepping closer. You think flashing that badge gives you a free pass? Think it puts you above the law? Pierce's gaze didn't waver. I don't consider myself above the law, officer. On the contrary, I work to uphold it. But it's becoming increasingly unclear what law you believe I've broken here tonight. Graves' hand hovered near his belt, a reflexive gesture that Pierce didn't fail to notice. I don't need to explain myself to you. Graves barked, his voice rising slightly. You might be an ADA, but out here I'm the one calling the shots. Interesting, Pierce said, his tone still maddeningly composed. If that's the case, I would hope those shots are grounded in sound reasoning and evidence. Otherwise, one might question their legitimacy. The subtle jab landed hard. Graves' face flushed, his frustration morphing into something more dangerous. He pointed a finger at Pierce, his voice a growl. You think you're clever, don't you? Sitting there all smug, thinking you've got me figured out. Pierce remained still, his voice measured. I don't presume to know you, officer, but I do recognize the direction this conversation has taken, and I find it concerning. Concerning? Graves scoffed, his laugh devoid of humor. What's concerning is someone like you throwing their weight around, trying to intimidate a cop for doing his job. Pierce tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. If intimidation was my goal, I assure you, I'd be going about it very differently. Graves bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. He was on the verge of saying something when another car approached, slowing as it passed the scene. The driver craned their neck, their curiosity evident. Graves waved them on, muttering under his breath before turning back to Pierce. This isn't over, he said sharply. I've got half a mind to bring you in for obstruction. Pierce raised an eyebrow. Obstruction? Of what precisely? Cooperating fully with your requests. Graves took another step forward, his posture aggressive. You're testing me, and I don't like being tested. Pierce didn't back down, his tone unshaken. I'm merely engaging in a dialogue, officer. If you find that challenging, perhaps the issue lies elsewhere. The words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed as though Graves might snap. His face reddened, his breathing heavy, but he managed to rein himself in just enough. Graves' face reddened slightly, his grip tightening on his belt. Is that a threat? Not at all, the man said smoothly. Merely an observation. I find it helpful to maintain transparency in these interactions. Graves' eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his voice dropping. You think you're better than me? Think your fancy suit and big words make you untouchable? The man met his gaze steadily, his expression calm. I think this conversation is revealing more about your assumptions than my intentions, officer. For a moment the two men stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. Graves' breathing grew heavier, his frustration mounting as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. Finally he pointed toward the car. Turn around and place your hands on the hood. Now. The man hesitated briefly before complying, his movements once again unhurried. I'll remind you again, officer, he said as he placed his hands flat on the cool metal surface. I have nothing to hide, but I hope you will consider the optics of this situation. Don't tell me how to do my job. Graves snapped, his voice rising slightly, as he began another search. You people always think you're above the law. The man's head turned slightly, his voice carrying a quiet steel. You people, he repeated, his words measured but loaded. Graves froze for a split second before covering his mistake with a scoff. You know what I mean. I'm not sure I do, the man replied. Perhaps you could clarify. His tone remained steady, but his words carried an edge that was impossible to ignore. Graves' lips pressed into a thin line, his composure slipping. He stepped back, motioning for the man to turn around. All right, big shot. Let's see some ID that explains who you really are. The man straightened up, his movements as deliberate as ever. If you insist, he said, reaching into his pocket. Though I'd advise you to be cautious with your assumptions moving forward. His hand emerged slowly, holding a leather wallet that he opened to reveal a gold badge gleaming under the fading sunlight. He raised it just enough for Graves to see clearly, watching as the officer's expression shifted from hostility to something closer to disbelief. Assistant District Attorney Alexander Pierce, the man said, his voice calm but firm. Fulton County, I believe you'll find everything in order. Graves' mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His gaze darted between the badge and the man's face, the weight of the revelation visibly throwing him off balance. Assistant District Attorney Pierce tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto Graves. Graves' brows furrowed as he stared at the badge, his skepticism hardening into something sharper. He folded his arms, leaning slightly closer, as if proximity might reveal a crack in the truth. Assistant District Attorney, huh? His tone carried a note of doubt. That's a nice title to throw around, but anybody could flash a badge and call themselves something fancy. You got any proof that thing's legit? Pierce didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unbroken. He let Graves' words hang in the air before responding. I'm sure you're familiar with the procedures for verifying credentials, officer. Feel free to run my name through your system. Graves' jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially by someone so composed. He took a step back, gesturing toward the car. Stay right there. Don't move. Pierce didn't move a muscle. Of course, officer. Take all the time you need. Graves stalked back to his patrol car, muttering under his breath as he slid into the driver's seat. He typed Pierce's name into the database, his fingers striking the keys, with more force than necessary. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the car's computer and the occasional crackle of his radio. The name popped up instantly, accompanied by a photo of Pierce in his professional attire. The title Assistant District Attorney was listed clearly beneath his name, along with a glowing record of high-profile cases. Graves' jaw clenched. He stared at the screen, unwilling to believe it. It didn't sit right with him, this polished man standing in front of him, unbothered by what was clearly intended to rattle him. The air in the patrol car felt heavy as Graves leaned back, running a hand over his face. But instead of conceding, he grabbed his radio, dialing in a channel. Dispatch, this is Unit 3257. I've got a suspect claiming to be an ADA out of Fulton County. Need confirmation on his badge number. Unit 3257, copy that. The dispatcher replied. Stand by. Graves glanced back at Pierce through the rearview mirror. The man stood. Get back in your car, he barked. And don't let me catch you pulling this kind of stunt again. Pierce's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. A stunt, you say? Well, I'll make a note to avoid being stopped for following traffic laws in the future. Graves' jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back, gesturing impatiently toward the sedan. Pierce nodded once and turned, moving with the same deliberate calm that had effaced his every action. He slid into the driver's seat, closing the door with a quiet click. Graves stood there for a moment, watching him with a mixture of frustration and unease. The engine purred to life, and Pierce rolled down the window, his gaze meeting Graves one last time. "I'll be sure to mention this interaction during my next meeting with the department," he said, his voice smooth but pointed. "I'm confident it will spark an interesting discussion." Graves' nostrils flared, but he said nothing. Pierce didn't wait for a response. He adjusted his mirror, signaled, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the officer standing alone in the fading light. Graves' fists clenched at his sides as he watched the taillights disappear down the street, his mind racing with unanswered questions and simmering resentment. Back in his patrol car, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts spiraling. Something about that man, about the entire interaction, gnawed at him in a way he couldn't shake. He reached for his radio again, debating whether to dig deeper into Pierce's background. Surely there had to be something that explained the man's unnerving confidence, his poised composure, and his refusal to falter under pressure. Graves stared at the computer screen, its glow illuminating his furrowed face. He wasn't done, not yet. His fingers hovered over the keys, an internal battle waging between letting it go and finding a reason, any reason, to prove Pierce wasn't untouchable. Before he could decide, a voice crackled through the radio, breaking his focus. "Unit 357 dispatch. You still out there on Elman Bay? Got another call near your location. Might need backup." Graves hesitated, gripping the receiver. His jaw worked as he fought the urge to brush the call aside. His eyes fell as he fought the urge to brush the call aside. His eyes flicked back to the database screen, Pierce's name still glowing, taunting him. Finally, he exhaled sharply and picked up the radio. "Copy, dispatch. Send the details." As the dispatcher relayed the new situation, Graves' gaze drifted back to where Pierce had driven off, his mind replaying their interaction over and over. Each word, each look, each subtle shift in power. But something about the man's quiet confidence wouldn't leave him, wouldn't let him rest. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Graves drove slowly, the dispatcher's voice fading into the background as his thoughts spiraled. The encounter with Pierce had unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully explain. The man hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resisted, hadn't done anything to justify the gut-level frustration Graves had felt during the stop. And yet, he couldn't shake the sensation that Pierce had won. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening as he replayed Pierce's last words. "I'm confident it will spark an interesting discussion." The smugness in the man's tone was like a splinter lodged in Graves' pride. What kind of discussion was Pierce planning to have? Was he calling the shots now? Graves ground his teeth. The idea of being the subject of an investigation, or worse, a public humiliation, making his blood boil. His thoughts were interrupted by the dispatcher's voice again. "Unit 357. Confirm if you're en route to the call on Maple Drive." "Copy that." Graves muttered into the radio, irritation seeping into his voice. He flipped on the lights and siren, the flash of red and blue illuminating the darkened streets as he made his way to the scene. A routine disturbance, the dispatcher had said. Something about a neighbor's noise complaint. Mundane. Predictable. Exactly the kind of thing that made him long for a more meaningful career. But meaningful in his mind meant power, control, respect. Things he felt slipping through his fingers in every interaction lately. As he pulled onto Maple Drive, the flashing lights caused a group of teenagers on bicycles to scatter, their laughter echoing into the night. Graves rolled down his window, glowering at them as they disappeared into a nearby alley. He parked in front of a modest two-story home, its porch light flickering, and stepped out of the patrol car. A middle-aged woman was seen walking past. Graves was not able to see her. He was not front of a modest two-story home, its porch light flickering, and stepped out of the patrol car. A middle-aged woman in a bathrobe waved at him from her front door. "Officer," she called, her voice high-pitched with irritation. "It's the house next door. They've been blaring music for the past hour, and I can't get a minute of peace." Graves nodded curtly, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway, as he approached the house in question. The muffled bass of music thudded through the walls, and he knocked loudly on the front door. The music cut off almost instantly, and moments later the door creaked open to reveal a man in his 50s, wearing a tank top and jeans. His eyes darted to Graves' badge, his demeanor instantly shifting from annoyance to nervousness. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked. "Got a noise complaint from your neighbor," Graves said, crossing his arms. "Mind keeping it down?" Yeah, sure thing," the man said, quickly nodding. "Sorry about that." A week later, Graves' worst fears materialized. He arrived at the station to find a memo waiting on his desk, an invitation to a mandatory departmental meeting regarding professional conduct and community relations. His stomach sank as he read the details, the words "guest speaker" leaping off the page. He didn't have to guess who the speaker would be. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning, and Graves spent the night tossing and turning, his mind racing with possibilities. Would Pierce call him out directly? Would he be humiliated in front of his peers? Or worse, would this lead to an official investigation? By the time the meeting began, Graves' nerves were shot. He sat stiffly in the back of the room as the station's chief introduced the guest speaker, Assistant District Attorney Alexander Pierce. Pierce entered the room with the same calm authority that had unnerved Graves during their roadside encounter. He wore a dark suit, his tie impeccably knotted, and his presence commanded immediate attention. The room fell silent as he approached the podium, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers. "Good morning," Pierce began, his voice steady and clear. "I want to start by saying that I have a deep respect for law enforcement. Your work is vital, and your sacrifices do not go unnoticed. But with that respect comes an expectation, a duty to uphold the integrity of your badge." Graves shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening as Pierce continued. "Over the past few years, I've had the opportunity to work closely with this department on several cases," Pierce said, "and while I've witnessed professionalism and dedication, I've also encountered moments that give me pause, moments where biases, assumptions, and unchecked authority threaten to undermine the trust we've worked so hard to build with our community." Pierce's eyes flicked briefly to the back of the room, locking onto Graves for a split second before moving on. The moment was brief, but it felt like an eternity. "Accountability is not a punishment," Pierce continued. "It's a responsibility. And as public servants, we owe it to ourselves and to those we serve to ensure that we hold each other to the highest standards." The rest of the speech was a blur to Graves. By the time the meeting ended, he felt a mix of anger and unease. Pierce had never mentioned him directly, but the implications were clear. This was a warning, a calculated reminder of who held the real power. Weeks passed, and Graves' paranoia deepened. He began second-guessing his every action, his every word. His fellow officers noticed the change, but no one said anything outright. Graves' confidence, once unshakable, was eroding under the weight of his own guilt and fear. And then one evening it all came crashing down. Graves was responding to a routine call when he noticed a familiar black sedan parked outside a courthouse. He froze, his heart pounding as he realized who the car belonged to. Before he could think, he spotted Pierce exiting the building, briefcase in hand. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither man moved. Pierce smiled faintly, inclining his head in acknowledgement before walking to his car. Graves watched him go, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. As Pierce drove away, Graves realized the truth. Pierce didn't need to file a complaint. He didn't need to escalate anything. The mere possibility of action had been enough to unravel Graves' carefully constructed facade. For the first time, Graves felt the weight of his own actions, the profiling, the hostility, the arrogance. It wasn't Pierce who had destroyed his sense of control. It was himself. A month later, Graves resigned from the force, citing personal reasons. The department didn't ask too many questions. His departure was quiet, unreathable. But Pierce knew. One evening, as Pierce reviewed case files in his office, an anonymous envelope arrived at his desk. Inside was a single piece of paper with a handwritten note. "You were right. The badge doesn't make us better than anyone. It makes us accountable to everyone. I failed that test. But maybe the next guy won't. M.H. Pierce leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile crossing his face. Sometimes Justice Pierce leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile crossing his face. Sometimes justice didn't need a courtroom. Sometimes the lesson was enough.